Hello, and welcome to the Casual Decks, where Dex does text on the decks that you want to play today. Today's video was recommended to us by a member of Into the 99 podcast by the name of Daniel, and when he gave me this idea, I knew I just had to make another deck. Now, before we hop in, I do want to mention that you can follow me on Instagram or find me on Discord in the links down below. While you're there, be sure to give Into the 99 a check out as well. Now, with that out of the way, let's get into the video. Today we'll be covering the Jeskai partner commanders Brallin Skyshark Rider and Shabraz the Skyshark. Brallin will leave your opponents seeing red in the waters is a 3/3 human shaman that costs 3 and a red that has partner with Shabraz, and whenever you discard a card you put a +1/+1 counter on Brallin Skyshark Rider and it deals 1 damage to each opponent. For 1 red we can also give target shark trample until end of turn. Shabraz the Skyshark is a great white with a bite, as a 3/3 flying shark bird, and costs 3 and white-blue that reads, whenever you draw a card, put a +1/+1 counter on Shabraz the Skyshark, and you gain 1 life. For 1 white or blue, target human also gains flying until end of turn. The idea behind this deck is to wheel our way through the build and stack up the counters on Brallin Shabraz while searching for ways to leave our opponents dead in the water. With all the cards we'll be drawing off of Shabraz, it'll be flying in to take a massive bite out of our opponents, while we discard what we don't currently need to let Brallin get to Brallin with our opponents and ping away as we go. This deck also runs a bit of a control shell with some light stacks, so you know this deck has some jaws to really sink its teeth into our opponents. Starting off with our lands and mana, we have 9 islands, 7 mountains, and 6 plains. Command Tower taps for any color we need within our commander's identity. Fabled Passage can be sacked to search for any color basic we need, and that land enters tapped unless we control 4 or more lands. These next lands do take a bite out of us when they're used, but we do have a Darkar Wastes, Battlefield Forge, and Sheevan Reef. All tap for colorless, or for the cost of 1 damage, they give us 1 colored mana within their respective colors. We also included the Shocklands with Sacred Foundry, Steam Vents, and Hollowed Fountain, and they do bite for 2 life if we do choose to allow them to enter untapped. The filter lands are also here with Cascade Bluffs, Mystic Gate, and Rugged Prairie. All tap for colorless or for 1 of their respective colors. We can net an extra mana for what they provide. Arcane Signet taps for any color within our deck's identity. Dockside Extortionist creates treasure tokens equal to the number of artifacts and enchantments our opponents control when it enters the battlefield, and Fellwar Stone taps for any 1 mana, any color an opponent's land could produce. Smothering Tithe gives us a treasure token whenever an opponent draws a card, which will be happening a lot when we wheel everyone, while Soul Ring taps for 2 colorless. We also have all 3 of our talismans, including Conviction, Creativity, and Progress. They all tap for 1 colorless, or hit us for 1 to tap for either of the colors they provide. If your opponents don't like control magic, then you definitely won't be able to plead not guilty, because we're running quite a bit of it. Counterspell lets us counter target spell, Dispel counters target instant spell, and Flusterstorm counters target instant or sorcery unless its controller pays 1, and has Storm, where we copy Flusterstorm for each spell cast before it this turn, and choose new targets for the copy. Muddle the Mixture counters target instant or sorcery, or for 1 colorless and 2 blue we can discard Muddle the Mixture, and search our library for a card with the same converted mana cost as this one. We do also have to reveal this card we just tutored for, so be sure to leave enough mana to cast it quickly, but we have to only cast this as a sorcery. Narset's Reversal lets us copy target instant or sorcery and return it to its controller's hand, and choose new targets for the copy, which can even be used to return our own spells to our hand and cast it again later if we want to. Negate counters target non-creature spell, and Swansong can counter target enchantment, instant, or sorcery, and its controller puts a 2/2 bird creature token onto the battlefield. If you're thinking this deck is bad so far, I'm just gonna have to call Bullshark. We are also running Alms Collector, a 3/4 with flash that reads if an opponent would draw 2 or more cards, instead you and that opponent each draw a card instead. Aven Mind Sensor is a 2/1 with flash and flying that kills our opponent's tutor effects by only allowing them to search the top 4 cards of their library instead, while Janeth Magistrate is a 1/3 that reads your opponents can't cast spells from anywhere other than their hands, which shuts down any casting from their decks or the graveyards, or any kind of playing from the exiled abilities. And the only planeswalker we have is Narset, Parter of Veils, which enters with 5 loyalty counters and a static ability that reads each opponent can't draw more than 1 card per turn. Her -2 ability also allows us to look at the top 4 cards of our library. We can then reveal a non-creature, non-land card from among them and put it into our hand. We then put the rest to the bottom of our library in any random order. Sorry for all the puns here, but I have no excuse for my sarcasm. But let's take a bite out of our opponent's plans with some removal and protection cards like Blasphemous Act. This costs 1 generic less for each creature on the battlefield and deals 13 damage to each of them in play. Chaos Warp makes a player shuffle target permanent into their library, then they reveal the top card of their library, and if it's a permanent card, they get to put it into play. Runaway Together lets us choose between 2 target creatures controlled by 2 different players, and then they bounce them to their own hands. Swords to Plowshare exiles target creature and its controller gains life equal to its power, and Vandal Blast lets us destroy target artifact we don't control, or for its overload cost of 4 and a red, we can change its text from target to each artifact we don't control. This card overloaded can really sink our opponents if timed right, so be sure to choose wisely when you cast this one. Boros Charm is a rather flexible instant that lets us choose between dealing 4 damage to target player, grants permanents we control indestructible until end of turn, or target creature gains double strike until end of turn. What's scarier than a giant flying shark? A giant flying shark that thinks that an opponent tastes so good it wants to come back for a second serving. Dissipation Field will bounce any permanent our opponents control back to their owner's hands if it deals any kind of damage to us, forcing them to cast it again, which can heavily disrupt any of their damage loops. Lightning Greaves gives the equipped creature haste and shroud, making the creature quick to the fight and unable to be targeted. Propaganda slows down the go-wide strategies by making our opponents pay 2 generic mana for each creature they decide to send our way, which also closes off the ability for them to respond to anything if we have something to cast, if they even bother sending anything at us to begin with. Swiftfoot Boots gives the equipped creature hexproof and haste, also protecting it from any kind of targeting spell our opponents may have. Brallin and Shabraz love going on adventures with each other, and we're bound to have a really good time with cards like Jace's Archivist, a 2/2 with 1 blue, and tap it, causing each player to discard their hand and draw cards equal to the greatest number of cards a player discarded this way. Magus of the Wheel is a 3/3 with 1 and a red, and tap it to sacrifice Magus of the Wheel, to make everyone discard their hands and draw 7 new cards. Molten Psyche makes each player shuffle the cards from their hands into their library, then draw that many cards, with a bonus where, if we control 3 or more artifacts, Molten Psyche deals damage to each opponent equal to the number of cards that player has drawn this turn. Tolarian Winds is a personal wheel effect, where only we discard our hand and then draw that many cards, while Wheel of Fate has Suspend for 1 and a red, where we exile Wheel of Fate with 4 time counters on it, and at our upkeep we remove a time counter from it for a delayed wheel, causing all players to discard their hands and draw a fresh 7 cards. Whirlpool Warrior is a 2/2 that causes us to shuffle our hand into the library and draw that many cards, and for a red we can sacrifice Whirlpool Warrior, causing each player to shuffle their hands into their library and draw that many cards. And Windfall is our final wheel effect, where each player discards their hand and draws cards equal to the greatest number of cards discarded this way. Between all of the wheeling effects we have in this deck, if we have Brallin or Shabraz or even both of them in play, we should have plenty of commander damage to start throwing around at people. Wheeling is not the only way we'll be swimming through our deck, because we also have cards like Brainstorm, where we draw 3 cards, then put 2 cards from our hands on top of our library, in any order, to pull what we want now and set up for what we want to get back later. Dream Trawler is a 3/5 with flying and lifelink, with whenever we draw a card, we put a +1/+0 counter on Dream Trawler until end of turn, and whenever Dream Crawler attacks, we draw a card and a free discard outlet that allows Dream Crawler to get hexproof until end of turn, but we do have to tap it if we use this ability. Faithless Looting lets us draw 2 cards, then discard 2 cards with flashback for 2 and a red to cast it again from the graveyard, but we have to exile it after doing so. Frantic Search is a free draw 2 and discard 2 if it's not countered, because it also allows us to untap 3 lands. While Key to the City taps and lets us discard a card to make target creature unable to be blocked this turn. Abuse this to swing in with a massive creature, or even surprise an opponent with damage by making another player's creature the target for this ability. And it also has an ability where whenever the Key to the City becomes tapped, we can pay 2 for an emergency card draw if we really need it. The following cards might leave your opponents with some nightmares, but for us it's a dream come true. Here are some spells that'll really bring attention to us if we've not already drawn out as much hate as we have cards from our library. Aetherflux Reservoir reads, whenever we cast a spell we gain 1 life for every spell we've cast this turn. We can also drop 50 life into it and blast an opponent out of the water and deal 50 right to their face. Allahammerit's Archive reads, if we would gain life, we gain twice that much life instead. And if we would draw a card, except for the first one or on each of our draw steps, we draw 2 cards instead. And Ever-Watching Threshold allows us to draw a card whenever an opponent attacks us or a planeswalker we control with 1 or more creatures. We all know I love zombies, so Grimoire of the Dead had to be included here for 1 generic and tap it and discard a card. We can put a study counter on Grimoire of the Dead. We can also tap it and remove 3 study counters from Grimoire of the Dead, as well as sacrifice it to put all creatures from all graveyards onto the battlefield under our control, and they're all black zombies in addition to their other colors and types. Gutter Snipe is a 2/2 that slaps each opponent for 2 whenever we cast an instant or sorcery spell, And Hoofprints of the Stag reads, whenever we draw a card, we put a hoofprint counter on Hoofprint of the Stag, and for 2 and a white, we can remove 4 hoofprint counters from Hoofprint of the Stag to create a 4/4 white elemental creature token with flying, but we can only activate this ability on our own turn. Library of Leng lets us skip our discard phase, and whenever a spell or an effect that causes us to discard a card, we may instead discard that card to the top of our library instead. Mindcrake reads, whenever an opponent loses life, that player puts that many cards from the top of their library into their graveyard, while Mystic Remora lets us draw a card every time an opponent plays a non-creature spell, unless that opponent pays 4. This also has a cumulative upkeep of 1, but we get to untap it before it triggers, so getting this out on turn 1 or 2 should net us some easy card draw unless an opponent don't want to feed the fish. Ominous Seas lets us put a 4-shadow counter on it whenever we draw a card, and if we remove 8 4-shadow counters, we put an 8/8 blue Kraken creature token into the battlefield, and it also has cycling for 2 generic, where we can discard this card and draw a card if we absolutely have to. Psychic Corrosion forces our opponents to put the top 2 cards of their library into the graveyard every time we draw a card. Rhystic Study lets us draw 1 whenever an opponent casts a spell unless they pay 1 to counter the trigger, and Sigil of Sleep is an enchantment aura that reads, whenever enchanted creature deals damage to a player, return target creature that opponent controls to its owner's hand. Teferi's Ageless Insight reads, if you would draw a card except for the first one you draw in each of your draw steps, draw 2 cards instead. The Locust God is a 4/4 with flying that reads, whenever we draw a card, create a 1/1 blue and red insect creature token with flying and haste. For 2 and a blue and a red, we can also draw a card, then discard a card, with a bonus ability where, whenever a Locust God dies, return it to its owner's hand at the beginning of the next end step. The Ozolith is a disgusting artifact that lets us move any counters from a creature to the Ozolith when it dies, and at the beginning of combat on our turn, if the Ozolith has counters on it, we can move those counters onto a target creature. You killed my shark? Well, guess what? We made a sequel. Toothy Imaginary Friend comes in as a 1/1, but whenever we draw a card, we put a +1/+1 counter on it, and when Toothy leaves the battlefield, which counts dying, exiled, or being bounced, we draw cards for every +1/+1 counter we had on it, and last but not least, we have Whirlwind of Thought, where whenever we cast a non-creature spell, we draw a card. So far, I hope you think this deck is jawsome, but we're not done yet. We still have some combos to go over and ways to bring them back if we're disrupted when trying to pull them off. We have mentioned quite a few ways to really abuse our opponents with our commanders, and even included a few cards with similar effects. But we've also decided to go overboard with cards like Curiosity and Ophidian Eye. Both of these read, whenever an enchanted creature deals damage to an opponent, you may draw a card. Ophidian Eye does cost 2 more mana than Curiosity, but it also has the benefit of having Flash. So we can cast it anytime we would cast an instant, which means before damage is applied, we can throw it onto the stack last second, and unless an opponent has a way to stop us, we're likely to just win the game right there if we cast it on the right creatures. The creatures in this deck that are best for abusing these 2 auras are our Commander Brallin Skyshark Rider, Glinthorn Buccaneer, as well as Niv Mizzet Perun. Attached to Brallin or Glinthorn, all we need to do is end the turn with at least 8 cards in hand. When we go to our discard step, we discard 1, triggering Brallin or the Buccaneer, then we draw a card and repeat as many times as we want until our opponents are dead or we have an empty library. Niv Mizzet Perun is a bit more flexible and can start the loop anytime we want simply by drawing a card first, because every time we draw a card, Niv pings each opponent for 1, and whenever an opponent casts an instant or sorcery, we get that easy card draw, and with Niv Mizzet also being unable to be countered, our opponents have to let it resolve, and if we put either of the auras on it and an opponent dares to try to do anything about it with an instant or sorcery, they've literally just started the loop that's about to kill them all. If anyone has managed to find a way to stop these loops from happening, or we've discarded some pieces throughout the game, we also have Sevinne's Reclamation as well as Underworld Breach as a backup plan to try again later, where Sevinne's Reclamation lets us return target permanent with converted mana cost 3 or less from our graveyard to the battlefield, and if the spell was cast from the graveyard with its flashback cost for 4 and a white, we may copy this spell and choose new targets for the copy and return 2 permanents instead, while Underworld Breach is the more powerful of the 2 options, where each non-land card in our graveyard has Escape, where its escape cost is equal to its converted mana cost, and exile 3 cards from our graveyard, so as long as we have plenty of cards in the bin and enough mana open, we can attempt to cast our win conditions over and over again, and then we sacrifice Underworld Breach and our end step if we didn't manage to secure the win. There we have it, everyone, another episode of Dex Techs, where Dex does techs on the decks that you want to play today. I do hope you've enjoyed today's video, and if you have, please consider subscribing. Leave a comment down below if you feel I missed some cards you would have added, or even share the video with a friend. This helps me out a lot, and I'm always happy to read the comments and will respond to as many as I can. And don't forget that you can find me on Discord and Instagram using the links down below. I'm your host Dex with the Casual Dex. It's been great, and I hope to see you next time.